Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining and welcome back to Wall Street Silver. Joining us today is a very special chicken, and that chicken is Doomberg. Doomberg, welcome back, sir.
Ivan, Jim, great to be back. Always love your show and enjoy my appearances on it, and looking forward to a great discussion today.
Yeah, it's an absolute pleasure having you back on. US PPI came in this week at 11.2%, and I seen on your Twitter saying it's a Putin price hike. Is this just Biden gaslighting? What's your opinion?
Yeah, we're having a little fun. Obviously, the administration is dealing with a crisis, we would say, the inflation crisis, which I know you guys have been paying attention to for a long time, and we've certainly been writing about and tweeting about. And here we are, double-digit PPI prints on the back of the highest CPI print yesterday in decades, 8.5%, which we all know is probably a gross underestimation of the real inflation struggles that mom and pop shops are dealing with and families are dealing with all across the country. And the spin, of course, out of the Biden administration is that all of this can be blamed on Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And of course, nobody would argue that that invasion isn't making things worse. But as you can see from this chart, we were on a pretty substantial trajectory long before that invasion occurred. There's no question that the supply chain snafus from both that invasion and the shocking situation that is unfolding in Shanghai are going to add to inflationary pressures. But we would argue, of course, that those inflationary pressures pre-existed. And of course, since those numbers have come out, we're seeing precious metal complex with a pretty strong bid under it, as you might expect. And gold is trying to fight its way back to 2000, and silver's being silver. But yeah, it's a little fun.
Silver's being silver. You're banned. You're off of this channel, man. Silver being silver.
I'm as frustrated as everybody else is with the price of silver, but we shall see where that goes. But in the long run, I think that the administration certainly does have substantial challenge ahead of it politically with the midterms coming up. With respect to inflation. They seem to be focused exclusively on inflation at the pump as the proxy. They've been making some moves to increase the ethanol going into gasoline, which is a bit of a surprise. I would think, given the choice between food and fuel, people would choose food first, but the administration is dealing with it in the way that it does. But the Putin price hike is the propaganda du jour. And as you guys know, a good tweet has to capture the current news flow, and so that's what we did there.
I totally agree. Here's a tweet that we made the other day along the same lines with when the CPI number came out a few days ago. The spin doctors are out in full force. They're blaming everything on Putin now. What's her name? Jen Psaki?
Yeah, Jen Psaki.
Yeah. Hey, none of this ever happened. There was no trillions of dollars printed in the past couple of years. None of that matters. It's all Putin now. All Putin. Blame everything on Putin. Everything bad in the world.
Well, this is what happens when you manage to the optics and not to the outcomes. And look, I mean, what are you going to do? I in a way, I sympathize with the communications team surrounding the president. He doesn't exactly invoke a lot of confidence when you hear him speak these days.
And when he does follow through, or doesn't do, when follow through, the exact opposite.
And they're not exactly dealt a great hand, but inflation is running amok. I think the supply chain issues are real. I think inflation in the mining sector, for example, has to put a bid under these precious metals, and the green metals for the energy transition here have been firing off pretty well. Everywhere you look in the economy, everything is more expensive. We tweeted out yesterday. I had a very good friend try to order a new car at a national brand, not like a small bespoke brand, but a real brand that you would know. And they were literally denied the opportunity to order because the quote order book was closed. And when we pressed the salesperson at the dealership that had no cars on the lot, their answer was, we can't commit to a price because we don't know when we're going to get this car.
So Doomberg, you just wrote this article with the CEO of Sprott, and it was about PSLV and the uranium trust, the silver trust, and how they function. What were the highlights from this article that you want to focus on?
Yeah, we had a great opportunity to have a sit down, almost an hour-long conversation with the CEO of Sprott Asset Management, which is the subset of Sprott Incorporated that manages their trusts. So including the the Silver Trust, PSLV, as you mentioned, the Physical Gold Trust. And we were very interested. Obviously, the article was focused on uranium, but we did also ask him a lot of questions about how PSLV works and how the Physical Gold Trust works and what the redemption rights are and how that works. And it's a very interesting interview. And we actually wanted to take the opportunity to clarify a lot of things because we see on FinTwit a lot of confusion about when PSLV or the Sprott Physical Uranium Trust is actually allowed to go and procure pounds. And many people thought that the trusts needed to be trading at a premium to its net asset value before it could go procure product. And that's just simply not true. Also, many people thought that the trust needed to trade at a premium so that they could raise shares, so they can get the cash to go stack, in this case, silver for your audience. It turns out as long as PSLV is trading at a higher net asset value than the day before, they can go ahead and issue shares and they can raise cash. And then once they have the cash, it doesn't really matter. They could just go buy silver, or in the uranium trust case, some uranium, or in the gold trust case, gold. Once they have the cash, they have the fiduciary responsibility to go and deploy that cash using nothing more than best efforts. And then the other thing we really wanted to nail down with him is just the ability for regular investors to redeem. One of the big challenges with GLD and SLV is only approved
Authorized
participants. Authorized participants can redeem, and he clarified with us that a 10,000 ounce silver redemption, you just give them the instructions and they'll send it your way, and a 400 ounce gold bar, London good, and you can redeem. And so that is actually what keeps the arbitrage tight, because big hedge funds know that they can go and redeem. And so, back to the sort of physical silver stacking phenomenon that, you just tweeted about earlier today. Our belief is that PSLV and Fizz are as good as it gets for sort of paper proxies for stacking physical, because they will stack it for you. They keep it in the Canadian Royal Mint. And he said they also store some silver, not just in Ottawa, but also in Winnipeg, in the Mint in Winnipeg. And it was a very interesting conversation, very sharp guy. Clearly, they have big growth ambitions. And I would say that their presence in uranium is going to have a spillover effect, a glow effect for their efforts in silver and gold. I mean, they're raising an enormous amount of investor resources for their uranium efforts. They just closed on the acquisition of URNM, which is an ETF of uranium miners, which we think they're going to grow a huge amount of investor inflows there. So, the whole Sprott complex is becoming bigger and bigger and bigger, and we think that's ultimately bullish for silver.
I remember we interviewed Rick Rule a while ago, and Rick was talking. I was asking Rick, is the silver really safe if it's vaulted with the Royal Canadian Mint? What if the Canadian government comes and seizes it all? And he says, and I jokingly asked, are the employees of Sprott willing to stand and defend against the Canadian Mounties when they come to take the silver? And he's like, I've found that a campaign donation is typically sufficient enough to keep the government in check.
Well, we actually asked him a similar question, and he described it as what counterparty risk. Ultimately, you have to have counterparty risk, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he said, are you more comfortable with the government of Canada as your counterparty, or HSBC, or JP Morgan, or Wells Fargo, or Bank of America? These institutions that were on the brink of failure in the last global financial crisis. And his answer was, the Royal Canadian Mint is a sovereign, it's a G7 country. The odds that they would so radically, of course, having said that, we've seen Justin Trudeau freeze people's bank accounts for making a donation to the trucker. So it's not zero. There is no such thing as zero counterparty risk. Look, in order for me personally, it's physical gold and silver that you have in your possession. Then it's physical gold and silver stored at an institution you trust. Then it's, I think, Sprott physical trusts. And then lastly, and a distant last, is the ultimate paper gold and silver GLD and SLV.
Well, I wouldn't even put those last ones on a list. I mean, that's just a non-starter for me. it's personal preference. I don't know. I'm gonna pass on SLV forever. In fact, I have a scheduled tweet that goes off like once every 3 months
Oh
on my
yeah.
Twitter account. Just reminder, SLV's fake. I've scheduled it for like a year in advance, once every 3 months.
That's
Well,
good.
we actually put a tweet out, a similar one that said the most interesting chart that might evolve in the next few months is the ratio of PHYS divided by GLD, the Sprott Physical Trust versus gold. And if the Russians ever peg their gold to the ruble and we see a spike in the price of gold, and they might actually, as we saw with nickel, which maybe we can talk about, they might just shut down trading on the LME because of a very large whale gets off sides and basically risks bankrupting the entire exchange. The London Metals Exchange, we think, is really dying. And this is the piece here, nickel in front of a steamroller, which talks about this Chinese billionaire who became so short nickel that he created basically a squeeze that has led both he and the banks that were backing him staring at billions of dollars in losses. And the LME intervened and basically broke the rules. And they
that was a crazy story. Crazy story.
And so
let's
that's
remind the audience what happened. How nickel essentially had a short squeeze. Remind the audience how high it went.
Yeah, so nickel was trading around $10,000 to $15,000, and it spiked to over 50,000 there. But that's where they undid a lot of the trades. It actually that chart doesn't show the trades they canceled, unfortunately. And so those were the trades that were undone. But even those, you can see, like it was, if you look back in the summer, it was trading around 15,000, maybe 16, 18,000. And then this Chinese billionaire who owns the largest nickel producer in China, and you could imagine that he was quote unquote hedging, but in reality, he was speculating, got very, very short nickel. And then Russia invaded Ukraine. And that caused a short squeeze. Everybody in the market knew he was short. And he sort of emptied their vaults, to use language that your audience might be familiar with. And they undid days of trades. Like imagine you were long nickel and you wanted to cash in because the short squeeze finally arrived. And to protect this guy and to protect the banks that were lending him the money to take these short positions, they basically changed the rules. And we think this is the beginning of the end of the LME.
The London Metals Exchange is not owned by anyone in London anymore. Mm-hmm. It's owned by a Chinese corporation. The one, I forget which one. You probably know off the top
based
of your
in
head.
Hong Kong. Yeah, based in Hong Kong.
Really?
Yeah. So, selling control of these Western exchanges to entities in China, they're going to violate the rules to protect their own. And that's exactly what happened with this nickel market.
Look at the draining. If you go back, they basically drained the nickel vault, right? I mean, this is
now what caused this is the white line you're referring to. They drained the vault, but this has been going on since, let's call it May or April of 2021.
Yeah.
Now what caused the nickel inventory to decline so much?
Once you get down to that, well, there's people standing for delivery, right?
Yeah.
And so once you get down to that critical level, look at the price action in nickel.
So is there a parallel here to silver? Because we have people on our subreddit, Wall Street Silver, that have been very closely watching the decline of silver inventory at the COMEX over the past year.
Well, that's the hope, right? Or the thesis, I guess one would say. But if you look what happened here, the reason why I bring this up in the context of the Sprott interview is if they stop trading of GLD or SLV, I don't know why Sprott's instruments would stop trading. And so here's a perfect example. Even though LME nickel stopped trading for all those days, as you recall, and they unwound trades and they had trouble starting it and they put new, position limits for the days, LME in Shanghai was still trading.
Yeah. And
you knew where LME nickel was going to go because LME Shanghai was trading at like 38,000. And so, but because of the position limits, they had to walk it down over 5 or 6 or 7 days. And the LME nickel versus Shanghai nickel arbitrage eventually closed. Sprott physical silver and physical gold trust trade independent of GLD and SLV, right? I mean, right now their arbitrage is very tight. And the difference between the two is de minimis. But at a true time of crisis, I think you could see a gap between those two instruments open up. And so we tweeted kind of half jokingly a few weeks ago that the most interesting chart in the next few months might be the ratio of Sprott divided by GLD.
Another article that you've written recently was on the cusp of an economic singularity. Yeah, this is one of your best ones ever.
Yeah.
And it's March 5th. The link will be in the description. Tell us about this.
Basically, a singularity is a concept from physics where the laws of physics break down sort of at a black hole or at a singularity. And the literal definition is since the laws of physics break down, it's impossible to know what the other side looks like, essentially. And effectively, the Big Bang Theory, in physics, basically what happened before the Big Bang Theory is both irrelevant and unknowable. And we're on basically the other side of a Big Bang. And we think the real crossing of the Rubicon here was sanctioning the Russian reserves, or as Putin would say, the US and Europe defaulted on their legal tender. And, if you look at Luke Groman's work and this fantastic podcast he did with Grant Williams, we are sort of, and even Zoltan Polsnar's recent pieces from Credit Suisse, it seems like we're heading towards a redefinition of money, a redefinition of the reserve currency. It seems like commodities and gold and silver and the precious metals are going to be a bigger and bigger, play a bigger and bigger role in the value of currencies and the backing of currencies. If the US dollar isn't dollar good, and it isn't for Russia, look, I mean, whatever you want to say about the invasion, this was a huge stat. Like they have sanctioned the central bank reserves. This is going to make the holding of dollars by countries that may find themselves being sanctioned themselves in the future less attractive. Mm-hmm. And it's going to make oil and gold and silver and grains, the real stuff that makes the economy go, more valuable on a relative basis. Now, there are lots of people who think that this is just a bump in the road, and they have counter arguments, and they think this is all sort of nonsense. But I don't know. It felt like a very, very big event to us. Felt like we crossed a Rubicon. No matter how justified it might seem today, there's no question that this was a decision that will reverberate for decades.
Yeah, weaponizing the dollar, weaponizing SWIFT, the way that they've done, I guarantee you a lot of countries are paying attention to this. As like China, I think everyone knows China's eventually going to make a move on Taiwan. And China is China more likely or less likely to hold US treasuries going forward after watching what's happened to Russia? Saudi Arabia, you remember that the current crown prince who had the journalist from the Washington Post murdered because he didn't like the criticism? That guy's on nobody's nice list. What if he does something again and he gets on the bad list? Do you think he's going to want to have Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund heavily invested in U.S. assets going forward? No, he's making trade deals with China to settle oil trades now in yuan, right? India's making trade deals with Russia to do trade settlement in their local currencies. You've seen a lot more bilateral trade deals in the past couple of months. Whenever I see them, I tweet about them because it's relevant. We're gradually seeing de-dollarization as a result of we have created counterparty risk for the US dollar and the euro, which wasn't there before, right?
Yeah. So the Luke Romans of the world would say that the reserves of these central banks are basically stored potential energy, that they would use these reserves to acquire their energy needs in the future. And the phrase petrodollar is a controversial one. There's very intelligent, passionate people on Twitter who think the whole concept of the petrodollar is a myth. I happen to not be among them. But the whole concept here is instead of the gold standard that the US for decades had committed to, a concept called, as good as gold for oil, that the US would manage the strength of the dollar such that energy was always procurable by countries that needed it using the US dollar, which was a stable store of value for the long term, especially in regards to their energy needs. And as we have written about many times, energy is life. And so if the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, which has a huge energy deficit, needs to import so much of its energy needs to keep the peace and to feed its people and to grow its economy, If they're storing all these US dollars as potential future energy, and the price of oil has now gone from, let's say steady state $30 to $40 a barrel to normalizing it well over 100, well then in oil terms, the value of those dollar reserves has collapsed. And the promise of as good as gold for oil has been violated. Now, Luke Roman and his camp would argue that that violation has its genesis in the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009, when Bernanke was faced with a decision to protect the dollar for the international aspects of the dollar or to protect the domestic US economy, and he chose the latter. And we are just in a slow motion sort of reshaping of the geopolitical / monetary landscape that has been shocked by the recent crisis of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But really, this is just sort of an inevitable thermodynamic end state that we're evolving to. And it's an interesting debate. I follow it closely on Twitter. I can't say that we have too much original to contribute to it, but it's a really fascinating concept and one we're prepared for, and it's consistent with our personal philosophy of focusing a lot of our savings on real assets as opposed to fiat currency.
I don't know if it was you or Luke Roman, but I saw a tweet the other day that just struck me in regards to the petrodollar, and it was I think I wish I could find it real quick, but it was basically saying, in the word petrodollar, the world's finding out that the petro part of that statement is a lot more important than the dollar part of that statement.
It had to be Luke because it wasn't me, but I concur with that sentiment, actually.
There was an interesting tweet about Shanghai recently. I'm going to share it now. Rebecca Kurzweil did this one. This is a graph that's measuring subway passenger volumes in Shanghai, one of the largest ports in the world. And let's zoom in on this. The black line is 2022. Shanghai's subway passenger volumes are currently 0. This is a major exporting port for the planet.
It's not just the Shanghai part. I mean, all of the ports in China right now, if you go and look at the marine traffic data, you can see just this huge congestion piling up, worse than anything we've seen before, as you point out in this chart. We text friends who are locked up in their apartment complexes for weeks. Who are
you were telling me about one of your friends who you warned this was coming.
Yeah.
And she and her family were able to stockpile, 30 days worth of food or 60 days.
Yeah, so I'm a bit of a prepper. I'm proud to say that I have a preparedness mindset. We've written about this on Doomberg before, and I had always been encouraging her and several of my other friends who live in Shanghai or live around the world that, hey, if you couldn't get food, how long could you last? And historically, people kind of chuckle at those types of suggestions. They think you're just being Chicken Little. You're just Doomberg. Of course, it's coming from Doomberg.
Yeah, you're the doomster, right?
But at the same time, I mean, these people, the ones that we've been able to help, are thrilled because they can keep a low profile. They don't have to go fight for the incremental calorie. They can keep their apartment doors locked, and they can wait out the crisis, knowing that they have for their family and their children and their pets. They have enough food that they can get by sort of the main crisis. And my whole philosophy is that if it goes longer than 30 days, it's probably not worth living anyway. So at least you should have 30 days and see what's still standing after 30 days of a true crisis. But you're talking, I mean, some of the videos out of Shanghai are just really shocking. Now, you have to be careful. Like, remember when we saw the videos of people collapsing in the street in the early days of the pandemic, and how much of that was misinformation?
The crisis actors, some of those people,
yeah.
I saw people analyzing those videos and saw the same person dying in multiple different cities.
But I can tell you that my friends that I'm texting are truly going through a situation which is pretty accurate to what we're seeing on Twitter. The deliveries are spotties. They can't go shopping. It's really dystopian, guys. Like, they have an app that the government loaded on their phone, and you have a code, and they mandate that you test. And if you get a false positive, they don't care. You're going to a camp. They're ripping you out of your house. You're going to go spend 2 weeks in some camp that probably, the equivalent of a semi-trailer with a bed in it, if you're lucky. And by the way, there's these tragic stories of people being forced to leave their pets behind and deciding what they're going to do. They don't know when they're coming back. There's really horrific video of how the Chinese are treating these pets that they find on the street.
Yeah, they're just killing them.
I saw a bunch of cats in bags all just together.
That's
probably
disturbing.
to be euthanized or disposed of in some way. It's
That's
really
very disturbing. There's videos of people leaping out of their apartment complex because the suicide rates are skyrocketing. It's really disturbing.
Do you think that China's overreacting in Shanghai for some ulterior motive? I mean, is there something else going on here? I mean, it does seem like a dramatic overreaction to COVID, where a lot of people already have had COVID. A lot of people are vaccinated for as much value as that's worth. Do you think the Chinese government's overreacting here and there's something else going on?
I don't, you know, I've given this a lot of thought. And the easiest and most logical explanation is the Chinese government fears it doesn't have the hospital capacity for executing the strategy that the US did, which is just let it run hot. Essentially, we did that here. We did have a very good vaccine and a good vaccination campaign, but also a lot of people just got it and they were asymptomatic and they developed natural immunity. It's been, there's no question that a lot of people have lost their life in the US, but by and large, in most parts of the country has stayed open. The pandemic has run its course, and we seem to be beyond the worst of it. China had a very strict zero tolerance policy. So the easiest explanation is that the CCP believes they don't have the capacity to handle the surge. The next logical explanation is, and I've seen this out there, and I'm not sure which of these theories to endorse. I'm just laying them out there for your listeners and viewers to consider. The next is that the CCP views defeating COVID as a point of pride / face-saving exercise that they must do. They must beat COVID, and that if they lose to COVID and this thing runs wild, it will be a significant blow to the reputation of the CCP, that they just can't have that. The third theory is this is cover for, now we're going from left to right here into more conspiratorial.
Nice.
And so the third theory is that this is a ruse to diminish the energy demand and food demand that they would otherwise not be able to meet because of the energy crisis and the war in Ukraine. So you're seeing already the substantially diminished demand for oil and gas in China as everyone is locked down in Shanghai, which is a major city and probably pretty energy intense. And then the last one that somebody floated to me that I'm not sure what to make of it, but is sort of seductive, as most conspiracy theories are. Xi is up for and angling for permanent appointment as sort of dictator for life in China. And there's a lot of palace intrigue as to whether or not some of the princelings might be opposed to that. And this is nobody would deny that this is at a minimum entirely embarrassing to Xi and an indictment on his leadership, and whether or not the people convincing him that zero COVID is possible might not have his best intentions in mind as they do so. So I don't know which of those theories makes the most sense to me. As many times as I've traveled to China and as many friends as I have in China, it's really an opaque and almost impossible. The CCP in particular is an opaque and almost impossible organization to penetrate. Who knows what's going on in the inner circle? But it's certainly a catastrophe, a human catastrophe, an economic catastrophe, and I think substantially underreported here in the West. Like this is going to reverberate for a very long time.
Yeah. Well, Doomberg, we want to thank you for coming on. You're always amazing to listen to. And we want to do it like many, many times in the future. You're my favorite green chicken on the planet and a lot of people's favorite green chicken. And let's do it again.
Awesome. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me on, guys. And congrats on all your success and best wishes for continued growth for all of your platforms, both the YouTube channel and Twitter and Reddit. And I know you're very active and love your stuff and a big fan of your show.
Thank you, everyone, click on the link in the description for Doomberg's Substack and go subscribe.
Thanks, guys.